What's up everyone, it's Skoda and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and we have probably the craziest ban and restricted announcement probably ever. I mean, Modern is a totally new format after this announcement, and all the other formats seem to be, I mean, Legacy has some pretty big changes to it as well, but really the formats that we care about here on this channel, you know, as you can already see, Standard, no changes, which is kind of what we expected. Pioneer, Jengatha getting banned is kind of honestly whatever for the format. I think a lot of people just got to play that card for free, so I mean it really just doesn't matter that that card is banned. It's probably just seen at a high enough usage, and the fact that Companion is probably one of the most busted mechanics of all time, because even with a nerf it was still pretty good as it turns out. But yeah, we're going to be focusing mainly on the Modern announcement, because again it has absolutely the most changes and some of the biggest changes I think we've ever seen to the Modern format, and that's probably an understatement to that. Like, Modern is a completely different format after this announcement. But of course, before we get into the announcement, we look at the details of the Modern ban and restricted announcement, and of course, and all the other ban announcements on this list. If you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we post mainly about the Modern and Pioneer content, as well as some other longer form videos, and of course, getting into Standard as well, because that is the premier RCQ kind of format, and well, the format's pretty great, honestly, and there's a lot of decks that you can play. But if you want to catch any of that stuff, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you'd like to go even further, down in the description I got a few links. One, go to my Discord server, feel free to join over there, as well as using the code that I have in the description down below for Manatraders if you want to get in on some of the hot Modern action, getting into Standard to prepare for the RCQ season, or just to play Pioneer, because Pioneer is still an amazing format even if it's not getting technically RCQ support. Then you can use my code to sign up for Manatraders and you'll get 5% off your monthly subscription. I want to thank Manatraders for sponsoring the channel, and let's go ahead and get into the actual announcement. So real quick, Standard, no changes. It's kind of what we expected. The metagame is pretty diverse, even if something like Dimir is, you know, seeing increasingly more play, and we're seeing a little bit less Golgari and even some of the other aggro decks. I still think the format is pretty wide open. I think that there's a pretty big share of the metagame share across enough decks to where, you know, Standard's probably in a pretty good place. And I don't think Dimir is absolutely dominant in the sense that it's just way better than what anyone else is doing. I just think that of the two, like, mid-range decks, I think it solves the mid-range problem a lot more than something like the Golgari deck does. And the fact that it's not, like, closing out the game very quickly isn't really an issue. Pioneer, we know that kind of like Rakdos has sort of started to become the best deck in the format, you know, in Rakdos Demons, and we've seen a few different iterations on it. I guess the format must not be in too terrible a shape, because the only thing I got banned was the Companion, Jengatha, which is basically the only playable Companion left that's seen like widespread play. So, and with like basically no restriction to it. I mean, I'm not surprised that Jengatha got banned, as we're just finally getting through and making way for other Companions that could potentially see play, but really they would have already started to see play if they were any good. So now we're going to probably see some other decks include them, but they're obviously not going to be nearly as good as like the 4 other ones that have been banned at this point. Modern is the big one. So in Modern, the One Ring, this was essentially a given. Like, this was like minus 4,000 odds. Like, you would have bet like $10 and lost $1 with like how good the odds were of the One Ring actually being banned. Amped Raptor, we talked about either Guide of Souls or Amped Raptor being banned from the format. You know, I think Amped Raptor is probably the most powerful based on potential of a card, because, you know, we've talked about a few times, and we've even done it on stream when we played the Boros Energy deck, where we've played an Amped Raptor on 2 after playing a Guide of Souls on 1, and then ended up spinning into something like a like the One Ring on turn 2. And really, aside from like the Eldrazi ramp decks that are playing like Ugin's Labyrinth, you really aren't playing a ring on turn 2. And the fact that the Boros Energy deck does it, where it's just going to kind of have like the Aether Vial kind of effect, where it just feels like the person playing Aether Vial is just getting so much value every turn, even though like they're not gaining any cards. They're just able to play 2 creatures a lot sooner than some of the other decks that are just trying to use mana to cast them, and they're getting more mana value out of their turns than, you know, the kind of lands that they have. And Amped Raptor kind of could do the same thing, where it was just going to get you such a huge kind of boost. You know, even if you just had something like a Guide of Souls or whatever, or even just an Aether Hub, you could still cast like a 3-cost card. You could Blood Moon your opponent, and then they have like absolutely no way of actually being able to interact with you. They're stuck with mountains or whatever, and it's going to be pretty hard for them to kind of beat it from there. So Manatraders going is probably on paper the most powerful of the two cards. I would have really liked to see Guide of Souls go along with Manatraders and just completely neuter the energy archetype, but it looks like the energy archetype will get to stick around for at least another ban cycle. Jengatha also getting banned here. Again, it was another card that was I think up there in terms of play percentage, and of course only ever seeing play as one copy because, well, there's no reason to play more than one copy. You play it in your sideboard. It's a free card that you always have access to. Just probably something that shouldn't exist in Magic, unless there's actually a deck building restriction to it. And I think a lot of these companions, as we talked about before, the restriction never really felt like a restriction or anything like that, and it was kind of something that you could easily kind of build into and arguably made your deck a lot better having access to the companion, which I guess is kind of the point, than just having this kind of restriction built in. So again, got nerfed, and it was still too good for the format, or for most formats, so it's probably just good that Jengatha is here. But we did get wrong. I didn't think they would unban anything. I thought that the modern format needed at least 2 or 3 cards banned, that they're not going to unban anything. I believe that the last time, at least I can remember, there being bannings and unbannings, I think it was when Golgari Grave Troll got unbanned. I don't know if there was any other time they did it. There probably has been, but that's the one that really sticks out in my mind because that ended pretty poorly, with Golgari Grave Troll kind of ending up on the list again very quickly. But we see Mox Opal unbanned, arguably dying for the sins of KCI, where Mox Opal, I think, definitely finds a home in some of the other, artifact-based decks. Of course, Affinity really loved Mox Opal because playing a 2-drop on turn 1 ends up being very powerful. We know that in the Breach decks, this is just something that you can kind of play into with your Emery, and this plays a little bit better than something like a Mox Amber, to where if your opponent is able to interact with your creatures and your Mox Amber is not going to add mana, where your Mox Opal is always going to add mana a 90% of the time, probably almost 100% of the time when you're playing those kind of Breach-style decks. We have Green Sun Zenith, which is a card I never thought was going to be able to come off the ban list. For X and a green, you search your library for a green creature card, which convert mana cost extra less, put it on the battlefield, shuffle your library, shuffle Green Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So this is a card that can search any green creature. I thought that with Titan, as long as it was in the format, Green Sun Zenith probably wasn't going to be able to see play. I know that Demonic Tutors was playing some kind of Yawgmoth deck that was playing Green Sun Zenith because you can go and get Dryad Arbor on turn 1 with this. You can go get various other mana dorks. You can get stuff like Grist with a Green Sun Zenith due to its static ability in your deck, or really in any other zone besides the battlefield. So this is definitely a very interesting card. This is going to be something that like I said, I never thought was going to come off the list along with the next card we're going to look at, but this is just a very powerful card. It's been a very powerful effect historically. There's been, these go wide elf decks that have played something like Green Sun Zenith. We know that. I think that Amulet Titan is going to want some number of Green Sun Zenith because this is just a way that you can get Titan, and unlike Summoner's Pact, you're never really going to have to pay for it later, and you're going to be able to kind of shuffle these back into your deck, and this card's almost never going to be a bad card necessarily. Faithless Looting getting unbanned, absolutely insane and almost villain behavior. The fact that they have the mystery booster art for this, and it's the IDW art rather than just having a regular Faithless Looting. But 1 mana, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, flashback for 1 and 2, or 1 red and 2 generic is absolutely villain behavior. I think Faithless Looting is arguably the most powerful card that they've unbanned in this announcement, and that's saying something with Mox Opal, Green Sun Zenith, and Splinter Twin being on this list. Faithless Looting enables too many strategies, really. Honestly, a lot of them. If there was going to be a card that ended up back on the ban list, maybe not the next time around, but in 6 months to a year, I think Faithless Looting is that card. While Green Sun Zenith and Mox Opal and Splinter Twin all have I guess between Green Sun and Splinter Twin have the ability to just straight up end the game, where Mox Opal is going to be a very powerful enabler. I think Faithless Looting is a very powerful enabler on the other side of it, where this is going to really discarding 2 cards isn't much of a drawback. Maybe in the early days of Magic, where you kind of wanted all these resources and you really couldn't use the graveyard to that much of an effect unless you were, bringing back something like an Ichrid or Nether Shadows and things like that. Faithless Looting nowadays, with 30 plus years of sets and the fact that the graveyard now more than ever is an integral part to certain strategies in the modern format, this just absolutely blows it wide open. We know that Phoenix desperately loved this card, and they now get it back. To say that Phoenix decks are not going to be tier 1 just because Faithless Looting came back, I'm not saying that, but there's definitely a lot of eyes kind of looking towards that strategy. We've seen Dredge kind of get brought up. We've seen various other graveyard strategies. I know kind of what we named for Mox Opal, with the Teamer Breach deck, liking something like Faithless Looting, because it's another way that you can kind of get cards into your graveyard. You can dig for kind of the pieces you're looking for, get rid of the cards you're not necessarily looking for. Flashing this back as well is not like the worst thing in the world. We also have things like Flage that are going to benefit from this, because this is going to be a way that you can get more cards in your graveyard early on, so then you can bring it back sooner. Again, not necessarily saying Flage is going to be an absolute slam dunk, one of the best creatures that you could be playing in the format, but it definitely does gain a lot, and a lot of decks do gain with Faithless Looting being unbanned. And again, I think probably the most powerful card and the most likely of the four, which again seems crazy to end up back on the ban list now, unless Mox Opal somehow does something absolutely crazy, or there's a lot of Green Sun Zenith decks kind of running around. I think that's probably what's going to take, is a lot of these decks seeing a lot of play early on and just, absolutely dominating for any of them to kind of end up back on the ban list very early. So Faithless Looting is the one I kind of expect to break the format a little bit more. We have Splinter Twin, of course, it's the last card, and this is the one that people thought was going to get unbanned forever, and it's 4 mana, like potentially win the game. There's already a few combos with people playing like FOMO to be able to make a copy of it and attack with it. And as long as you have Delirium, you untap the Splinter Twin FOMO, you hit your opponent for 2, and then, continue to repeat the process with like infinite combats to attack your opponent. So, definitely just doing Splinter Twin things. We talked about Splinter Twin possibly, not really being all that good. How many years after its banning? I think, 7-8 years at this point since it was first banned. There's a lot of early interaction. There's a lot of 0, 1, and 2 mana interaction spells that work very well against Splinter Twin. And, if people are especially focusing more on the FOMO version, there's even more spells where we have Lightning Bolt and Galvanic Discharge, with essentially without any additional investment, being able to take care of it. I could expect things like Unholy Heat to see more play, just because a lot of those decks kind of want Delirium. So like Unholy Heat is just kind of like this 6 damage spell that is going to end up killing a lot of the creatures on the other side. So definitely some interesting stuff there. Modern is in a crazy spot, and honestly I wouldn't want to be in the position to be coming up with decks and figuring out exactly what is good, for like this coming up weekend to play in those tournaments. But definitely playing one of these 4 cards, because these are definitely 4 very powerful cards that I didn't think that really Faithless Looting, Green Sun Zenith, we were never going to get. I think Mox Opal was kind of bordering on okay. I think that KCI not being legal is totally fine, and I think Mox Opal becomes a better card, probably for some of the other aggro or artifact like aggro strategies, and just being able to kind of, again, play some 2-3 mana cards like on turn 1, and I think that's totally fine in this format as of right now. I think that something like a Grinding Station, Teamer Breach deck is probably something that benefits pretty highly from Mox Opal being unbanned. Of course, those decks also kind of getting to play around with Faithless Looting and just kind of the busted things that it enables. Legacy, we have Psychic Frog and Vexing Bauble. Vexing Bauble is just crazy. If no mana was spent to cast it, you counter the spell, and then you can sacrifice it to draw a card. And, it's whenever a player, so it is a symmetrical effect, but the fact that you could just play this and kind of protect yourself from things like Force of Will, protect you from like the alternate cost of something like a Daze, and Psychic Frog just probably, like past Grist was probably, or not Grist, Grief was probably one of the best creatures to play in that format as well, just also being a blue card. You pitch the Force of Will. So these bannings probably needed to happen here in Legacy. Of course, Modern being kind of like the main focus. So we'll kind of jump over to Modern and, see kind of the reasoning for those bans. So looking into Modern, this is written by Dan Musser. Going into the announcement, it was clear that Modern needed the most help among our competitive formats, which was very true. We went from essentially having Nadu kind of running the format into Boros Energy, and then Boros Energy slowly accumulating the metagame share over time. And then we saw the Mardu energy decks kind of jump up to second, and then they started to kind of fall by the wayside. And then when we saw Belcher and the Dimir Murktide decks kind of start to take over, and then it was better to play Mardu, but there was still an overwhelming majority of people playing Boros Energy and making up almost a third, and I think at some point over a third of the metagame just between those two decks, which were essentially the same, minus some of them playing things like Thoughtseize and Orcish Bowmaster, maybe sometimes Chthonian Nightmare, which I really did like the Mardu versions of the deck because of Chthonian Nightmare. I think it just kind of created like a super grindy deck that could kind of beat the mirror, and I think that was kind of the reasoning behind kind of playing it on top of being able to beat some of the bad matchups, but it never really caught on quite like the Boros Energy deck, which just had a little bit more of a consistent mana base and a more straightforward game plan. But in our previous actions in August, we addressed the most glaring issue in the format, Nadu, of course, but things haven't gotten much better. Technically speaking, I think that Boros is a little bit more of an interactive deck. I think Nadu is interactive in a worse way, where you're just trying to essentially protect the king in a way where Boros Energy, you had some creatures that were very clearly like your best creatures, but you didn't necessarily need them because they all just kind of synergize very well together. They're just like kind of a well-oiled machine. We analyzed a handful of options to try and get the format into a spot where the players would enjoy it and excited about. However, we felt more was needed. Our players are the backbone of competitive Magic. We can observe tournament results, analyze the metagame, dig into win rates all day long, but if you are playing these formats, at the end of the day, it is our job to ensure that you're having as much fun as possible. Modern is the same format as it was years ago, with several cards we banned years ago. Since then, several new sets have been released, specifically Modern Horizon sets have been a sizable impact on the format. As such, we decided it was time to set free a handful of cards. We'll start by talking through each of the bannings and then moving on to the cards that will be unbanned. So we already know like the One Ring was absolutely going to end up getting banned. It was the most played card by far. Over 50% of decks kind of submitted were playing the One Ring, and most of them were playing 4 copies. Some playing 3, but it was either because you just wanted to be a contrarian, or didn't really weren't able to get access to the 4th copy of the ring. Because if you had an ability to get 4 rings, you just had 4 rings. Is probably the most optimal way to build a lot of these decks. The opportunity cost of including the One Ring in nearly any deck is too low, and the presence in events has become tiresome for many players. Acting as a tool of self-preservation and a resource of card advantage, it requires no commitment in a particular color. We believe it is clear, as it has been for many of you, that Modern would be a more enjoyable format without this inclusion, and thus the One Ring has been banned in Modern, which, again, the cycle of players casting a ring, getting protection, and then getting to draw a few cards, and then playing another ring and everything like that. Or, you're kind of hoping that, okay, my opponent has to die to their own One Ring, and then they end up just like drawing, 15, 20 cards, and they end up finding another ring and getting to reset the protection and everything. And that's basically kind of like your win condition. There's definitely some things that were wrong with the ring. And, it's just better that it's not in the format, unless there's like a way of like changing the ring so like the player accumulates the counters or whatever, and then you have to find a way to get a ring off of the battlefield, which I guess could also cause some problems. So probably just good that something like that doesn't exist in the format. Removing the One Ring certainly hits Boros Energy, Modern's most played and most consistently dominant deck, but it also impacts several other strategies. We like to ensure that we reduce the overall win and play percentages of Boros Energy directly, though we don't want to eliminate it from the format like we did recently with Nadu. We consider many cards and decide to knock out Boros Energy a few packs. Guide of Souls, Ajani Nakano Pariah, Flage, Flage among them. However, we landed on Amped Raptor, which we kind of pointed out some of these cards too. I think Ajani is probably like a fine card to kind of keep around, but I think Guide of Souls, Flage, Amped Raptor were kind of the cards that should have been like the main focus of that kind of ban talk. Each of these options could be reasonably be included in a few other archetypes. While Amped Raptor only appears in Boros Energy, Amped Raptor allows for some of the deck's most explosive starts, acting as an energy enabler and a payoff, and often amounting into 1 extra to 4 mana in the early turns of the game. So Amped Raptor is banned in Modern. This is kind of the same reasons that we outlined when we talked about Amped Raptor. It just gives you so much value early on. The potential to play a 4-cost card on turn 2 is, essentially you get to play 6 mana worth of stuff on turn 2 when your opponent, if they're not on like the Boros Energy deck, is doing something obviously way worse than something like that. As far as being Jangotha, many of the same reasons Arya explained above to apply to Modern. Ultimately, the decision to avoid cards that have more than 1 mana symbol isn't a very interesting or fun one to make, and by making a couple swaps in deck building, you can get access to a mostly free 5/5, earning you a couple of percentage points in the win column. This reduces the pool of options you might consider when building decks and turns an overall less diverse format. Jangotha is clocking around 40% of all Modern decks, from Energy to Zoo to several other fringe archetypes. To reduce the dominance of Boros Energy and increase the amount of diverse card choices available in Modern, Jangotha the Wellspring is banned, which, again, makes total sense. Everyone's just including it for free. What kind of fun is that? I don't think that restriction is very fun to kind of play around with, and you essentially kind of hit the, you satisfy the cost of having the card very easily just by, probably playing some of the best cards and leaving out something like Walking Ballista in some of the like Tron decks. You just put it in the sideboard and Jengatha was satisfied, and you can still go get it with Karn and stuff like that. I'm not saying that that's like a direct example, but that's something where you wanted to play this card, and like that's probably the card that you'd most want to play, but you don't have to play it in your main deck, so you can have access to this card while also still having access to the card you wanted. So something to keep in mind there. The bans above should do a decent job of making the format more fun and balanced, but could it even be better? When we ban cards, we tackle problems as they arise, using tournament data and community feedback to navigate the format to a better place. This combination of objective and subjective reasoning has its flaws. Namely, the more sets released into a given format, the more powerful it becomes. We've examined several cards on the banned and restricted list and introduced some to the modern format. It is worth noting that this is the beginning of a new era. Many of you have given feedback time and time again about the good old days of Modern before Modern Horizons sets started increasing the power level of the format and making iconic decks obsolete. After long consideration, we chose the initial list of cards to unban. We'll closely monitor these cards' impact on Modern over the upcoming events in the regional championship season, and come March 31st, 2025, evaluate how things are looking. Did we make Modern a better place? Can we handle a wave of nostalgic and infamous cards to re-enter the Modern? Was there something we released at making Modern less fun? Only time will tell, so let's get into it. For much of Modern's history, artifact decks have been a pillar of the format, with the deck's original Affinity, Croc Clan Ironworks, and even Lantern Control, but it has been a while since we've seen such strategies be competitively viable. We took a couple shots to evaluate artifact strategies in Modern Horizons 2 and Modern Horizons 3, but alas, the power simply wasn't there. Mox Opal was banned in 2020 after the introduction of Modern Horizons, which included our good friend Urza Lord High Artificer in this sweet mystery booster art here. While opening hands containing Mox Opal can be quite explosive, it's not like we ever stopped printing strong anti-artifact cards, looking at Meltdown and Wrath the Skies that were printed in MH3. Our expectations are that the reintroduction of Mox Opal will arise several interesting artifact strategies, both old and new, in adding the power to strong decks. So Mox Opal is unbanned in Modern, which again, I think this is a fine ban. I don't think in this format, like the artifact decks playing certain things on turn 2 is going to be, or like 2 mana spells on turn 2, or casting a bunch of like really good 1 mana spells on turn 2. Or you know what I mean, that Mox Opal is going to definitely make decks more explosive. It's going to make them more powerful overall, but I don't know if it's going to make them so powerful where they're absolutely going to dominate the format. I think like the Affinity decks that we were used to seeing way back in like the, I guess the early parts of the Modern format and kind of through the 2010s is long gone. I think that a lot of these artifact decks are going to be focused on kind of going a little bit bigger with some other things, kind of like the Turtle Man that I cannot think of off the top of my head. But, I think that overall Mox Opal is a pretty good unban, and we could see some decks that, kind of like what they were trying to accomplish, that some old archetypes of the Modern format can make a return thanks to Mox Opal, just kind of giving them access to extra mana on the early turns of the game and allow them to kind of establish, more lock pieces in terms of the like Lantern Control decks, and maybe some more explosive draws and more of an affinity-based strategy. Now moving on to Green Sun, has been banned in Modern since 2011. Banned during a time when green decks were too strong, the card offered a level of consistency and flexibility that was difficult to combat, often narrowing the range of cards you consider playing. In fact, the logic we used to ban Jengatha this time around applies to why Green Sun Zenith was banned in the first place, but that was over a decade ago. Today, green-based creature decks are few and far between. Even Basking Brute Scale combo can't use Green Sun Zenith to find its namesake because Brute Scale is devoid. It's just colorless because it's an Eldrazi lizard that looks very deformed. Yawgmoth combo has basically fallen off the map, and while finding Grist with Hunger Tide is nifty, keycards like Orcish Bowmaster, Yawgmoth Iron Physician, and Zulaport Cutthroat are unable to be tutored. Can Elves make a resurgence? Modern Horizons 3 reprinted Sylvan Safekeeper and Wirewood Symbiote. Maybe some old favorites like Dryad Arbor, Primeval Titan will be entering more often. To help increase metagame diversity, Green Sun Zenith is unbanned in Modern, and we've talked about some type. I think the only thing that's going to make Elves like super playable between all the good cards I got from MH2 and MH3 to kind of help the deck kind of reach the legacy status, short of getting something like a Gaia's Cradle, which would be an insane card if it somehow got reprinted. Pretty sure it's on the reserve list. But short of that, I don't think Elves is going to be super playable, but there is Glimpse of Nature, which I think is a card that, can potentially make that deck potentially busted now that Green Sun Zenith is unbanned, and if they somehow get both of those cards and at the same time, I think that deck would be pretty insane. Back in 2019, after PT Barcelona, it's clear that Hogak was stronger than intended. One of the cards that died for Hogak's sins, Faithless Looting, which I don't know if that's necessarily true. Faithless Looting was a really good card, don't get me wrong, but I think Hogak was just a completely insane card, and Faithless Looting just enabled a lot of different strategies. That even at the time, we'd seen like Arc-Like Phoenix, Hollow One, Dredge, that they list here, were end up being like very good cards, and Faithless Looting just absolutely, turboed them into absolute absurdity. One of the cards that died for sins was Faithless Looting, but Faithless Looting has propped up a multitude of strategies with Arc-Like Phoenix, Hollow One, Dredge, and even some fair mid-range decks like Young Pyromancer and Seasoned Pyromancer all played Faithless Looting, and that was probably like Mardu Pyromancer, Boros Pyromancer, like those kind of decks were pretty sweet playing Faithless Looting, as they were doing it pretty fair, and these decks were just doing absurd things with the fact that you can draw 2, discard 2, and with your graveyard being more of a resource nowadays, Faithless Looting just being that much better of a card. I think 5 years later, we're interested in seeing what Faithless Looting can do without a certain giant avatar rearing its ugly head. Much like the discussion of Mox Opal, we introduced several anti-graveyard options in Modern since Ludi's removal, namely Endurance and Bogart Trawler. Faithless Looting is now unbanned in Modern. It's a question for the ages. Splinter Twin, too strong in today's Modern. Twin is banned back in 2016 after consistently being at the top of the metagame and taking down a few Pro Tours, and essentially being the go-to deck for a lot of Modern players, where it was just kind of like a new threat would kind of pop up. Maybe it would be just a little bit better than Splinter Twin, but just the sheer consistency of Splinter Twin and like the years of people getting to play it and kind of the mastery and things like that and finding the right tech options just overall ended up being kind of a better deck in the long term than, some of the other short-term strategies like we would see with like Pod. A fear of tapping out on turn 3 onto 3 open mana and dying was real. You would hold up mana for removal or try to progress your board state in the hopes of getting the game over before you could possibly assemble a 1-2 punch of Pestermite and Splinter Twin. History tells us that replacing Splinter Twin with Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker doesn't cut it. So can 8 years of format evolution keep the Twin deck in check? We think it can. Answers exist that once didn't, including several 0-mana cards that can keep you alive if your opponent decides to tap out for a 4-mana enchantment. Solitude, Force of Negation, Force of Vigor, and Flare Denial have all seen competitive Modern play and can solve any play patterns the deck once exhibited. And the fact that people are going with FOMO too means that Force of Vigor is going to even be a lot better of a card than what it actually is, or rather what it was. Not that this card was ever really bad, but, that's just kind of like the new evolution of kind of the Twin deck, is that you can just get rid of, both pieces of the combo and kind of set your opponent back a little bit. So that's pretty neat there. Unlike Mox Opal, Faithless Looting, Green Sun Zenith, which can support multiple different strategies, Splinter Twin only supports one strategy, but the whole point of today's reversed bans is to call back to Moderns of yesteryear. Each card was justifiably removed from Modern in the past, but times have changed and we realize that Modern isn't what it used to be. Splinter Twin is a symbolic era of Modern that takes people back, let people look back on fondly, and is now free. Enjoy the memes, which is absolutely diabolical to include in this. So we're not going to look at the other formats. We know that Jengatha is just kind of like a card that players played a lot of, so we're not really going to look at Pioneer in that sense. And of course, Standard didn't have any sort of bannings. So overall, how do I feel about this ban list? I think it's been crazy. It's honestly an insane kind of list that we got here. We had 3 cards that, absolutely needed to go. We know that the Boros Energy definitely took a hit, but definitely can still exist in the format, and I think doesn't necessarily, become like better than ever, I would say, but definitely with something like Faithless Looting, I could see it potentially finding its way into the Boros Energy decks as a way to kind of filter through, draws where you end up kind of flooding out, and then, of course, giving you something to kind of fall back on later. Of course, also being able to fuel the graveyard for something like a Flage, which we know is very powerful and is one of the best closers in Modern, I believe, still, outside of cards that just kind of like win the game on the spot. So with Amped Raptor being gone, also making the deck kind of, less spiky in a way where you're not going to be able to get 5-6 mana worth of stuff on turn 2, especially like being on the play as well, just absolutely burying your opponent and making it very hard for them to kind of come back while you haven't really spent any extra resources besides a few energy, which a deck that was just full of creatures and ways of just getting energy by playing creatures really wasn't that big of a cost. Jengatha, again, just being a card that was super annoying because at least before, you could kind of tell it's like someone was playing Jengatha, you can narrow down certain things, but then there were so many decks decks now that are just playing it, that, you know, it is essentially just a free card that, you know, like they said, can give you like a few percentage points, especially if you're someone that can remember that you have a Jangotha in the companion zone. So overall, you know, I'm pretty happy with the bannings. I think maybe you could have went a little bit deeper, but, you know, I also don't think that they make super rash decisions like that, where they just ban like 4, 5, 6 cards, unless it's something that is very problematic. And I think that for right now that those changes are pretty good. One that we kind of expected in the One Ring, you know, the Guide of Souls or Amp Raptor was kind of like back and forth. Ultimately, I think Amp Raptor is probably one of the better ones without, you know, absolutely killing the energy deck. And Jangotha, kind of like whatever. I just have a cool one, and I am really sad, and it'll probably end up in one of my cases or something like that. The unbans, I think Faithless Looting by far and away is the best card, with Green Sun Zenith and Mox Opal kind of fighting for, you know, the spot of second place as far as the power. I think that those cards are a little bit more narrow than something like a Faithless Looting. I could just see a lot of the red decks wanting to slam this card into them. Of course, we know that there's a lot more graveyard hate in the format. We know that there's better graveyard hate. There's more access to it. That said, that never really stopped Faithless Looting at all. I think that was just more of like a check to the people wanting to play like Dredge and these other graveyard based strategies, you know, with Faithless Looting. And I think that you probably can have some fair Faithless Looting decks that are just trying to use it as a way to kind of filter their draws. You know, if you have more lands, kind of ditch the extra lands. If you have creatures or different spells that you don't want, you just have like lands that you want to keep, you can ditch those as well. So there's definitely fair uses for something like Faithless Looting. I just think that even then, there's still plenty of strategies that can just use kind of like every part of Faithless Looting to kind of forward their own game plan and make life very difficult for the other people playing Modern. So I think at the end of the day, Faithless Looting is going to be probably the most powerful card that is unbanned just from a gut reaction. Green Sun Zenith can do some pretty broken things. I think the fact that people were still playing Amulet Titan, and, you know, Amulet Titan is such a good deck, and it's so researched and everything like that, that just giving it access to something like Green Sun Zenith, even at like one or two copies, or even the full 4 if they so choose to, just makes the deck even more consistency. And with them being able to go for, like, say, the Dryad kills where they have Valakut, then they can go and use their Green Sun Zenith to go get like their win condition. Heck, they could even use like 2 mana to then go get their Boreal Grazer, and then if they have 2 amulets in play, they end up netting a mana from it, and they can make 4 mana off of something like that, you know, after spending just 2 mana. So there's definitely things that they can do with Green Sun Zenith. I think Mox Opal is kind of like the only card that's really going to check Green Sun Zenith in terms of, you know, which one is more powerful. I think it's going to be 2A and 2B with that. And Splinter Twin just, I think, effectively being the worst one, just because, again, I think there is more interaction that players are already playing that already kind of check Splinter Twin. Now, does that mean Splinter Twin is going to be an absolute joke? No, I think players are still going to play Splinter Twin, no matter how. It has to be like laughably bad for people to not play it, and for it to not exist at all in the format. I think for a lot of players that are nostalgic for the format, they're going to kind of come back to Modern and try to play these cards. And I think that 3 of the 4 cards are very clearly, very blatantly, very powerful, and the 4th one, I think the jury is still out for me anyway, as if Splinter Twin is going to be able to kind of reach the same heights or kind of live up to it in terms of, you know, its impact on the format, where it was one of the best decks. I don't expect it to necessarily be one of the best decks, but certainly it being a player in the Modern format and something that you can do in the Modern format and something that players are going to have fun doing, then totally, I think so. But I think Faithless Looting by far is the one that is the most likely to kind of end up on the ban list. I think Splinter Twin is going to stay off of it for the time being. I wouldn't be surprised if in a year or two, you know, we saw Faithless Looting. Actually, if it took over a year, I'd be very surprised if Faithless Looting was just kind of a fine card for the format. Also, Mox Opal, Green Sun Zenith kind of being somewhere in between, where there's a very fine line of them being like good for the format, but not too good to where they need to kind of be watched to kind of be put on the ban list. So yeah, this was a pretty long video. Let me know what you all think in the comments down below of the ban and restricted announcement. Overall, I think it was a very, very good announcement and very impactful, and a heck of a way to end 2024 and look forward to the 2025 Modern season when we get to the end of the current standard RCQ season. So, yeah, like I said, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I do post a lot about the standard, Modern, and Pioneer formats, so if any issue, please consider subscribing. Check out the links in the description down below. I'll have the announcement linked down there as well, so you can check it out and read the article for yourself. But that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoy the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.